So today I want to talk about the future of conferences because conferences have been around for a long time. Some people are predicting it's their demise because of things like virtual reality and teleconferencing and video conferencing and webinars, and it's just not going to die. So conferences, there's always going to be a need for conferences, but the format and the style and the value of conferences has changed. So I want to talk about some of the things that have changed today and some of the things that are coming up in the future, so that whatever role you play in a conference, you'll have some idea of what's coming up in the future. Because if you think about a conference, the conference used to be an event. It was about lighting the spark under people. People would get together. It would be a great event. But now we're looking at not just a sparkler, but actually lighting a fire. So the conferences that used to run successfully, that formula doesn't work as well anymore. So if you think about the range of conferences, the three kinds that you don't want are the conferences that either don't get enough registration, so they're cancelled, or people turn up and it's just a drain because it just seems like they'd be better off being back at work and actually doing something productive, or they're bland. There's actually not much value in them and it's like the same old, same old. And unfortunately, a lot of those conferences, they used to work and now they don't anymore. So if you're involved in a conference as a speaker, a sponsor, a conference organizer, an organization who runs conferences, if you keep running them the same way, the chances are you'll fall into one of these three categories. So what you want to do, the more positive side of that, is to have a conference that's is engaging at the event itself. You want a conference that people talk about, that people remember after the event, and ideally you want a conference that people talk about, they remark about it, and they keep talking about it after the event. So the future of conferences is creating events that are engaging, which is in the moment, memorable, so people remember them afterwards, and remarkable, so people talk about them and spread the word. So they want to come back next year, and also they get value that they can put into place in their workplace. Okay, so what does that mean? So we're going to look at some trends, some threats, and some tools. But first of all, before we get into those, I'd like to know who's in the room. So I'm going to share a poll here, and the poll here is, what is your main conference role? Now, the people here have got different roles in conferences, so I'm going to make this, let me launch the poll here so you can see the options. So the 5 options that I've got here, well, the 4 plus an other, is are you a conference organizer? So either a professional conference organizer or somebody tasked to organize the conferences in your workplace. Are you some kind of presenter? And that could be an MC, a keynote speaker, breakout speaker, facilitator, panel moderator, and so on, a sponsor or exhibitor. And what I put down as owner is, are you the company that's actually running the organization that's running the conference? It might be an association, a club, a company, the group that's running it. So I'm just give you a few seconds to answer that. And if you've answered other, I'd just be interested to know what is the other. So if you could type that in the question box, and I'll just read it out. I'll keep all these responses here anonymous. Okay, great. Thank you for responding quickly. I stop the polls when we get about 80%, and we've got more than 80% here. So yeah, we've got some MCs here. Great, that's good. So let me share I reckon we've got almost everybody's responded. So let me share the results here. Okay, so most people here, more than 80%, 85% are conference organizers or presenters. Great. So I'll, as much as possible, give you examples that fall into those two categories as we go through. And 21% other. There's there's a couple of others here as well who are saying MC, facilitator, organizer of small group get-together. So you're maybe not a conference so much, but a smaller event. Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's look at these 3 areas about the future of conferences. We've only got half an hour together, but I want to cover 6 things. And I want to give you 2 ideas around 2 trends that are happening worldwide, but that affect conferences everywhere, 2 threats to the traditional kind of conference, and 2 broad tools or groups of tools that you can use as a conference. So let's make this as a conference organizer or a presenter if you want to tap into the future of conferences. There's this quotation that I share in many of my presentations, which I think applies especially if you're established in your business or established in your role. And Upton Sinclair said this. He said, it's difficult to get somebody to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. So there are a lot of people who've been very, very successful in their past roles, and as a result of that, it may be a bit of a risk, dare I say, disruptive, to have some new ideas thrust at you, thrust on you, which might be a little bit different from what you've always done. And so, um, the, my message here is just be a little bit open-minded about this, and some of the ideas may be a little bit different, confrontational even, and provocative, but just think about how you could actually implement them in your roles and in your job. Okay, so let's look at these three areas, and we'll start off with these two major trends. And when we're talking about conferences, I think it's obvious that the two trends we've got to start with have to do with demographics. It has to do with people, because without the people who are attending a conference, without attendees, there is no conference. So as much as I'd like to think that as an opening keynote speaker for a 3-day conference, I'm the most important person at the conference, I know I'm not. It's the 200 to 1,200 people that are in the audience who are attending. So let me show you broadly two trends in terms of the people who are attending conferences now. So I'll give you a global trend, and then I'll talk about the diversity of the people who might be actually in the room. So the global trend is that our world population is changing, and so this is at a very macro level. So if you think about, for most the last 50 years, our world economy has been dominated by the G7 countries, the USA and Canada, the UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. But PwC has predicted, and you can read this in the World in 2050 report from PwC, that by 2030, the G7 power economically is going to be matched by what they call the emerging economies, which are the E7, which are, as you can see here, Mexico and Brazil, Turkey and Russia, India, China, Indonesia. And then by 2050, the G7 power will have faded, and the E7 economies will also be matched by 7 others, which they call the F7, or the frontier markets. So we have the emerging and the frontier markets, which will also share that economic power. So we have Peru and Colombia, Nigeria and Morocco, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. So in a generation from now, this is what our world is going to look like. And I know that most of the people here on today's webinar are Australian. So if you think about what about Australia and what's Australia's role in this, I think we have a very strong role, because Australia is going to be a very, very attractive place for anywhere in the world to live and work and to attend conferences. We've got a democratic government, we've got a strong economy relatively, we've still got a good financial system and a stable currency, and there's a few other things that make our little country really attractive. And not only as a place to live, and that is definitely going to increase, but also as a destination. China is already our biggest visitors from tourism, taken over from the USA and the UK, and just in terms of visits for personal or professional life, Australia is going to become very, very attractive in the next generation or so. Mainly because you saw those big population areas, and economic power is right on our doorstep, or we're right on the doorstep of that economic power. The second thing that's happening is that the people in your room are a little bit different. And if you think about broadly the 3 generations of people in your room, and I'm going to be very stereotyped here, but broadly there are 3 generations who are going to be in your conference audience. The baby boomers, who make up, they're all roughly about a third, but the baby boomers a little less than a third, according to McCrindle. They're the people who are the traditional conference attendees. They're kind of happy with the lecture style of presentation. They're happy with the person at the front of the room presenting, and they sit there mostly passively participating, but actively, like raising their hands, talking to the people next to them, and so on. The Gen X is the next generation, which is currently the biggest in Australia in a conference audience, and that's my generation. They're the people who they want to be we, so they want to have more group work. They want to be involved in discussions and conversations. So they're not just happy sitting there listening to somebody at the front of the room. And then, of course, there's the Gen Y, which is currently about a third, but growing. And of course, they're the I generation. So they absolutely want to be involved, but they also want to be involved at an individual level. So they want to have their voice heard, not only as part of a group, but also individually. And so some of the technology that's available, and I'll show you some of that later, is about making sure that they get their individual voices heard. Okay, so those are two things, the two big trends to do with conference audiences. And let's look at two threats. So this is now we're looking at what can get in the way of the traditional conference. In other words, what are people doing instead of attending conferences? And again, this is not black and white. It's not saying the conference is dying and these two things are going to take over, but it's saying that there is a shift away from only attending conferences and going to currently online, but soon in the future virtual as well. So let's look at online, because we all know this. We're right now engaged in an online experience. If you're here live on the webinar, then you're engaged in an online event. If you're watching the recording, again, you're engaged in an online event. So what's happening online? I remember as a kid, when I was 8 years old, I remember reading about the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and I was amazed as an 8-year-old kid. Here were these other kids out in the outback with no school anywhere near them, but they could still get an education. And now, of course, we call that virtual learning, e-learning, online learning, but we invented it here in Australia 100 years ago. And so now, with online learning, there's lots of different variations of this. One of them, which has become popular, and it's had its detractors, but has become really popular, is this idea of a MOOC, a massive open online course. I'm not going to run a poll here, but I've often asked in my audiences how many people have done a MOOC, have actually attended one, not created one, but actually attended it. And I reckon it's fewer than 5% of people in the room put up their hands. And I think this is a real pity, because if you're involved in any sort of conferences at any level, I reckon you should be at the very least attend a MOOC or two. And some of them are really big, they're global, and you could be in a room with 100,000 other people, but you don't have to be. I reckon you should start off by going to opentostudy.com, which is backed by a number of Australian and New Zealand universities, and they provide high quality adult education to the general public, free to anybody with an internet connection. If you've never done this, I reckon it should be one of your New Year's resolutions to actually attend an Open to Study MOOC, just so you get an experience of what it's like. Because your conference, or the attendees at your conference audiences, delegates, attendees are doing this. They're attending it through public MOOCs like this, or their organization is setting up some sort of online training on their intranet, and they have their own online training and engagement programs. So do it, because if you don't, then you don't understand what your audiences are already doing. It's so easy to do. When you do understand it, then you also understand that a conference is no longer just an event. It's one part of the journey for the conference attendee, for the delegate. So there are things that, as a presenter, as an organizer, even as a sponsor, you can provide for people before and after their event to get more value from it. So it's crucial. And I've just listed a few things here that you can offer. You can do surveys before. So as an example, we send out surveys to our audiences beforehand. I'll do a pre-event video. I might interview the CEO of the conference, and that gets sent out as part of the preliminary marketing material. Maybe there's a post-conference report. I've got an app that people can sign up to free, so they can get ongoing resources and so on. So as a speaker, as a presenter, are you offering these sort of resources to your delegates? And as a conference organizer, are you asking your presenters, your speakers, and even your sponsors to provide these sort of resources? Just as a quick example, so for me, as a conference speaker, for all my clients, we offer a whole bunch of things. So obviously, one of the main things is to deliver a great presentation, but that's kind of the price of entry now. People assume that you're going to do that, but we provide a whole bunch of things before, during, and after the event as well. And particularly the before and after are the things that really add value and turn this from just an event to part of the audience member's journey. So this is the first part of it, that online you can provide a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't replace what you do at the event, but it adds to it and enhances it and complements it. So as a conference organizer, make sure that your presenters are providing these sort of resources. And if you are a presenter, and more than half the people today in the room are presenters, make sure that you're offering some of these resources. Not every client will want all of these. No one's ever bought all of these. However, some will buy and some will take some of these options. But if you don't offer them, they don't have that option available to them. So that's the first part of it. That's the online part of it. The virtual part is virtual reality. Now, this is still a few years away, and there's some promises that it's going to, completely replace physical reality. And I think some of those are a little bit optimistic. So this is a few years away, but it's still worthwhile knowing about it. So virtual reality is this is an example of me. I was speaking at a real estate conference, and realestate.com was demonstrating the use of their VR virtual reality app for doing property walkthroughs. So if you are interested in buying a property, you can go through a virtual walkthrough, and it's like walking around inside the property. And these are getting more and more advanced now. They're still in the very basic stages, but they're getting more and more advanced. Again, if you haven't used virtual reality before, if you haven't experienced it, then I recommend that you do. You can buy a virtual reality headset for a couple of $100, or you can get for about $10 a Google Cardboard, which is a bit of cardboard. You fold it 6 times and it turns your smartphone into a virtual reality headset. And again, I recommend that you should do this. If you've never experienced it before, it's worth doing just to understand the potential. And even if you think it's a bit basic now, just imagine in 5 years' time how good it will be. The impact of this for conferences is not just that you can do a virtual walkthrough of a conference venue, for example, but that you'll be able to upload yourself into a virtual reality world. So I went to a Futurist conference last year in Melbourne, and this guy here was demonstrating how to use virtual reality for actually create a virtual reality model of yourself. So you go into a studio, and he has these like 87 cameras. He takes a photo and creates a 3D model of you. Now, in the exhibition space at the Melbourne Convention Centre, he didn't have his whole setup, so he only had about 6 cameras, but he was doing 3D facial scans. Of course, I went and did it, and he created a 3D model of my face, of my head, and he emailed that to me later, and I could just move my mouse around and get this 3D model. So you can imagine in the future that you'll be able to attend a conference by actually your virtual reality avatar attending the conference. So I could upload myself, somebody from somewhere around the world could upload themselves, and we would be as if we were talking to each other, sitting next to each other, exchanging notes with each other, as if we were there live at the same event, but it could be from anywhere around the world. So as I said, this is a little bit, it's not quite there yet, but it will be reasonably soon. So it's something to be aware of in the next few years. Okay, let me just stop and see if there's any questions about that, because so far we've talked about tools and threats. Before we get on to the third area, which are we've talked about trends and threats. Before we get on to the tools, let me just quickly stop and see if there's any questions or comments about it. Okay, so Jim says, will there always be a case for an in-person conference? I've used the word in-person, but for a live conference, yeah. So, even virtual reality is live, but so I call it in-person, and I think there will. So there will always be the case for people attending an event in person, so you can stand face-to-face, belly-to-belly, in protein form, as some people call it, and have those conversations. That's absolutely right. However, it does... the role is changing. So now we have to focus more on what that in-person experience provides, knowing that things like online and virtual are going to provide some of those what conference used to provide. Okay, questions here. What recommendation would you make about electronic engagement in person with a live audience to blend the two worlds? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. For the speaker and the audience, Oscar, so you're saying, so Yeah, so are you talking about an online event, Oscar? I'm not quite sure. Or are you talking about, say, an in-person event where there's also live streaming? That's what I'm curious to know. Yes, an in-person event, so electronic engagement. In fact, we're just about to get to that. I'll show you some of the tools, Oscar. I think that'll answer your question. Have those three generation stereotypes been your personal experience at conferences? Cecilia asks. Yes, so absolutely right, Cecilia. So when I prepare my presentations, even as a keynote speaker, it's mostly presenting rather than facilitating, interacting, and so on. I try to make sure that I've got things that will connect with all three of those generations. So you'll see some of the online tools that are used. I'm going to demonstrate one of them now. They also get people to speak at their tables and have that we conversation. And most of it, as a keynote presenter, is them looking at me as a presenter at the front of the room. So absolutely trying to make sure that I engage with all those three generations. Okay, let's talk about the tools because a couple of people asked about that. We talked about threats. Jay Summit, in his book Disrupt Yourself, says that every threat is an opportunity in disguise, and it's absolutely true. So let's look at a couple of the tools, and I'm going to talk about broad categories of tools rather than really specific tools because the specifics are going to change for each person. But let's look at two broad categories of tools, and we're talking about the format of your presentation and also interaction in session, which I think was Oscar's question. So again, remember, if you complete the exit survey, I will send you the special report, The Future of Conferences, which goes into this in a bit more detail. And the 10 things that are in that, some of them are related to the tools. So we've already talked about from event to journey, but also making them active participants in whatever sessions you run and whatever sessions are available at the event, and having in-session collaboration. Those are two of the things that great conferences now do differently. So let's look at those two things. So first of all, the format. So it's got to be more than just people attending a session now. How do you create greater participation? And the first way is in the actual kind of session that you offer. So the traditional conference sessions, the traditional conference program has these kind of sessions. You're probably familiar with them. You probably organized them or presented at them or emceed them or definitely attended these. But then there's a whole bunch of other formats that are becoming popular now in conferences. So some of these that you may have heard of, and even some of these others, which are starting to gain some traction in conference programs. So I'm not going to go into any of these in detail. I just want you to understand that there's a whole bunch of these that are now available. Feel free to take a screen snapshot of this if you want to. And if you want to know more about some of these, I know there are people on the webinar today who are experts in some of the things like appreciative inquiry or open space or World Cafe. But just understand that these are some of the things that are in your toolkit in terms of the format of your conference individual sessions. Then once you get inside the session, how do you create interaction? So how do you create interaction within your session? So the traditional way of doing it is doing things like show of hands, getting people to talk to each other, getting people to write on flip charts. You have flip charts around the room. You get people in groups and they have a discussion, put up their best ideas on the flip chart. And that's fine. You should certainly do that. But also consider including some of these other tools. And if you're a conference organizer, it might mean investing in some of the technology to make some of this stuff happen. If you're a presenter, it may mean that you invest in some of the technology to make this happen. So these are some of the things that I've seen being used at conferences, and I don't think I've yet seen a conference that uses all these tools. However, I've definitely seen conferences using all of these, but not all together at the same time. So let me just quickly stop and just check if anyone's got any questions about what these tools actually are. Let me briefly tell you what you've got here. So online Q&A is where people can ask questions publicly and everyone else sees the questions and maybe a moderator chooses which ones are asked of the presenter, or the participants themselves, they can vote on which questions they want the presenter to ask, and those ones go up to the top of the list. And there are whiteboards that are like it's an online whiteboard rather than a small whiteboard or flip chart at the front of the room, which a big audience can't see. There are online polls, the sort of thing that we did earlier, but you can do that in a live, in an in-person conference as well. You can have bulletin boards. Your conference app can have a conversation thing in there like a Twitter back channel. And of course, you can have live streaming as well. Let's do one of these. So just as an exercise, I'm going to show you here the screen. And what I'll do is, let me make this full screen here so you can see the whole screen. Okay, so on your screen, you'll see a poll question. And let me just see if I can get the technology working here. I'll just talk among yourselves for a sec while I paste in this link into the screen here. So in the chat room, you'll see a little link here to the poll. And the poll is a question for you to answer. And I'll see if I can get it to appear on the screen. It's not appearing on the screen at the moment, but you should be able to see it. If you click there, you'll be able to do the poll. So this is an online poll of where will you attend, organize, or present conferences next year. So if you open this up in your web browser window, you'll go to that section, and you'll be able to see the poll results coming up. Okay, so I just want to check whether that's coming out because I can't show it to you on my screen, even though I'm trying to. Okay, I can see people responding, which is good. I just can't quite get it to appear on the actual webinar window here. Okay, but if you're going to that, you can see it happening at the moment, and then I'll show you what the results look like. Great, thanks for doing that. Okay, so just to give you an example of what that looks like, so you can see this yourself on the screen, but if you're on the recording, you won't be able to see it. So let me just show you a snapshot of what's coming up here. So this is just one kind of example, one example of ways that you can get your conference attendees, delegates, in an audience live to participate. And this is called a word cloud, and it's one of the tools that's available as an online tool. Coming back to, say, the Gen Ys, they want to engage individually, and this is a simple way to get your conference audiences to interact using technology and to be part of the event without you having to, ask them individually for their input. So it's one of the tools that you can use. It's one of the many tools that's available now to conference organizers and to presenters. And this is one of those things that an organizer doesn't have to set up for you. You can set it up yourself privately. But of course, there are other tools that the conference organizer might set up for you. I'm noticing now more and more organizers have a conference, more and more events have a conference app. And as much as possible, I will help out and engage with the conference app. So polls can be run through the app. The kind of back channel can be run through the app. Even that kind of word cloud can be run through the app. And if possible, make use of the app because our audiences are starting to use it. And if you're an organizer or a presenter, then encourage people to use the app as well. It provides really useful analytics and data for the conference organizer. And some of that's not immediately visible, but it's really valuable information for them even after the conference. Okay, so we talked about these three things here. We talked about two trends, which are demographic trends about the people in the audience. We talked about two alternatives that people are looking at. So they're looking at not necessarily alternative to a conference, but alternative to some of the content from the conference. Getting it online or getting it in the future through virtual reality. And we talked about these two tools, which is one of them is about the format of your session, and the other one is about the in-session interaction. Just one last story, one last metaphor. If I ask you now, is this a heap of sand? And it may look like brown sugar, but if you pretend that's sand, you'd probably say, yes, that's a heap of sand. If I took away a grain of sand, it would still be a heap of sand, right? I could take away hundreds, even thousands of grains from there, and it's still a heap of sand. And yet, if I kept going, eventually you'll just get a few scattered grains of sand there. And you say, no, that's not a heap. So my question is this: when did it stop becoming a heap of sand? And the answer is that there actually is no specific point at which you can say, no, that grain turned it from a heap into not a heap. And I think this is what happens with a lot of businesses, a lot of industries, a lot of disruption happens like this. It actually doesn't happen suddenly. It's not like a wind comes along and blows all the sand away and there's a few grains left. What happens is that in the context of a conference, you might lose a delegate because they've moved away, or you might lose somebody else because they've decided they can't afford to attend this year and they'd rather do it online. You might lose somebody else because they have decided that they can get enough value without attending the conference. You might lose somebody else because their weekly video conference gives them the networking that they needed. And eventually you'll find that you might wake up one day and find that, oh, I actually don't have a conference anymore. I don't have enough delegates to make it worthwhile. Don't fall into that trap. Just understand that each of these little grains of sand is contributing to the big picture. So my last message for you is start before you're ready. Don't wait for everything to line up perfectly, because it very rarely does, and the world's not going to stop for you until you're ready. So do what you can right now. As I said, if you complete the exit survey, I'd be very happy to send you a complimentary copy of my ebook, which is about what 10 things that great conference organizers do differently. If you're a presenter, speaker, then absolutely, I think you'll find value in there, because of course, part of our job is not just to turn up when we're due to speak, present, and then leave, but make sure that we're part of the team that creates a great event. So you'll get some value from that as well. And thank you everyone for playing. Thank you for participating. Thank you for engaging. And I hope you got some value from that. If you've got any questions, please email me. You can see my email address there, gihan@gihanpereira.com. Thanks for coming along. And I wish you all a safe and happy Christmas, and see you again for this webinar series next year. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.